Well, thanks so much, everyone, for being here today. We'll be talking about evaluating hydrology forecasts, which is one of our favorite topics. So we're very excited. And yeah, I appreciate you all taking time out of your day to listen in. So for our agenda today, we will start off with going through some industry best practice and forecast evaluations, some challenges as well. Then we'll jump to a behind the scenes case study where we evaluate HydroForecast. And then we'll go through why that's important, why that matters for your business. And we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So throughout the talk, please drop your questions as you think of them in the chat. We'll do our best to get to them at the end. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar and it'll be emailed to you at the end. We'll email it out tomorrow. So if for whatever reason something happens, you have to drop early, you can catch up on the rest later. If you would like closed captions and translations, you can go to the bottom of your screen in Zoom. In the middle, there's a toolbar, and you should be able to turn them on. Yeah, and we've got some polls throughout the webinar. I think there's one up right now. I'm still figuring out my screen orientation. Yep, there it is. Cool. So if you could just fill it out and let us know a little bit about your role, that will help us understand why you're here today. And without further ado, we will get started. So we are a company called Upstream Tech, and we are a small but mighty team. There's around 35 of us. We're remote, so we are scattered around. As I mentioned, I'm in New Hampshire. So we have a range of backgrounds. There are folks on the team who are experts in machine learning, water resource management, hydrology. Personally, my background is in earth science and also data analysis. My role here at Upstream, along with Hunter, is that we're on the customer success team, and we do the evaluations for all of our forecasts with our customers. So it's a topic, as I mentioned, we're really excited about. Pass it over to you, Hunter.
Well, thanks, Melanie. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining this webinar. We're really excited to dive into our evaluation process. A bit about myself. My name is Hunter Johnson. I work on the same team as Melanie as a customer success manager, and my background's in civil environmental engineering with a specialty in hydrology and water resources engineering. And I'll also add that at Upstream, we have two products. One is called Lens, which is a remote sensing driven product. And the other one's HydroForecast, which is the hydrology forecast product. And Melanie and myself work on HydroForecast, and that's what we'll be diving into today. Nice. So yeah, as Melanie said during the outline slide, we have a couple things we're going to talk about. First, we're just going to kind of set the stage and understand why we want to do an evaluation, what we're evaluating. And as we walk through that, we'll get into more details of some of the challenges, some of the tips and tricks we have, and we'll culminate all that with a case study tying together the theory with something in practice. So before I go into the operational evaluation aspect, I just want to kind of define some terms. So when we're building hydrology models, the calibrate and have a whole evaluation process before the model's operational. But once the model's operational, we periodically want to evaluate it for several purposes. And this webinar is really going to focus on that second operational part of the model performance. So why do we want to evaluate operational forecasts? So we understand what the accuracy model is, and more importantly, what the impacts of the model have been during operations. We also want to understand if things were different or similar between operations and during the calibration and validation period. So we're looking for trends, patterns, things that might have been unexpected that we didn't notice or we didn't see during the calibration validation period. And part of that is also understanding how we can improve our model. We're very R&D heavy here at HydroForecast. So we're constantly looking for patterns across all of our customers around the world and understanding how we can improve the model through further research and development. And very important as well, we want to understand how the operational forecasts are being used. So data that we're providing that understand some of those questions and to start answering them, it's helpful to understand who the user is, what is their use case, and try to start understanding how we can tailor and customize the evaluation to really highlight and emphasize what that specific customer is interested in. So people are using HydroForecast for all different types of reasons. We listed a couple here, and they are quite varied. So some people are very interested in extreme flows, high flows, low flows from things like hurricanes and atmospheric rivers. Some folks are also interested in more of the day-to-day normal flow conditions for things like energy trading. And we have another poll to help us understand who we have in the audience and what your use case might be. So please fill that out just so we have a bit more information. And yeah, we're always interested to understand who is actually here. And yeah, some other use cases are more of a long-term horizon. So using a seasonal forecast to do things like water budgets for reservoir operations to make sure that there's enough water in the reservoir during dry periods, or make sure there's enough room in the reservoir for wet periods for things like preventing floods or preventing droughts. So yeah, with that, I'll pass off to Melanie to talk a little bit more about some of the specific things we look at during evaluations.
Awesome. And yes, please definitely fill out the poll. That would be great. All right. So I want to take a quick step back and just chat a little bit about HydroForecast. This is, you might all know this, but just in case, we'll go over some of the basics. So HydroForecast is a flow forecast. It's a theory-guided machine learning model, and it's a type of neural network known as a long short-term memory network. This here is a screenshot from our dashboard where we display the forecasts. And the way the forecasts work is they're a neural network at their core. We'd use the long short-term memory network, or the LSTM for short, because it's really great at learning long-term relationships. So you can think about how snowpack will translate to spring runoff. And we pair this machine learning model with physical inputs. So we feed it weather inputs and also in situ flow data so that it can learn the hydrology in your basin. So it's physics informed, it's adaptable to a number of different basins. It can operate anywhere in the world, so it can operate in gauged and ungauged locations. And yeah, this is one example, one snapshot of HydroForecast here on the screen. In dark blue, we have our HydroForecast mean, which is this 10-day flow forecast. And this is one from the past. So this time series here is from this past spring. And the black line is our observations, so which is why we have data here for the entire period of what was once a forecast. And then the shaded blue, the dark blue, is our 50% confidence interval, and surrounding that is the 90% confidence interval in the light blue. So you could expect that it's 90% chance the flows will fall within that range. And this dashed red line here is the NOAA Northwest River Forecast Center prediction for the same time period. We really like to display both forecasts alongside each other because it's a great way for us to have all the information at our fingertips at once. So if you have two models saying the same thing, that's awesome. That's great confidence in the upcoming flow predictions. Okay, now jumping back to the evaluations and looking at what aspects of the forecast are important to think about when we're considering, is the forecast accurate and how we evaluate it. So as Hunter mentioned before, for historical events, we won't be talking about that too much in this talk, but it is something that is super critical to our model. So because the model learns hydrology, it's trained with actual hydrological data, and we will also validate it on real data. So that's why historical events is on there. And then for the aspects of the forecast that we look at in evaluations, might be the ascending limb, so the time when the flows start to rise. Some folks will care a lot about the actual peak flow magnitude and timing. Other folks care a lot about, did you get the total volume right? Or how accurate was the recession limb? And so there are so many different aspects of the forecast that we will consider when we're deciding whether or not the forecasts are accurate. I'm also going to talk about how there are some challenges when we're doing evaluations, and we'll kind of highlight a few of them here. As I mentioned on the last slide, we have a probabilistic forecast. So that is super helpful when you're trying to understand the range of flow possibilities that could occur. When we do most of our evaluations at the moment, we are looking at how accurate HydroForecast mean was, because that's our best prediction for the upcoming forecast. And that can be limiting at times. So sometimes we'll, then also go back to see, well, did that 50% confidence interval capture the event? And, especially in times where conditions are really anomalous. So for example, if there was a 1 in 100 year flood event, you wouldn't expect that the actual mean would predict that. So it's kind of outside of what the mean is. And that's where the confidence intervals can be very, very valuable. Well, just one of the instances where they can be. The other aspect of evaluation is that you want to make sure you have a really good length of time that you're evaluating over. So sometimes folks will, myself included, look at an event and, maybe the event we underpredicted and jump to a conclusion that the forecast is biased low, which sometimes that could be true. But we really want to make sure that we have a long period of time that we're calculating these metrics over to get a true snapshot of how well the model is performing. I surveyed our engineering team ahead of this talk to see what they think the best amount of time is. And for a short-term model, they recommend that you have at least a year of data to compare against in past forecasts. So that might not necessarily need to be a consecutive year. You could have it broken up over time, but making sure you have enough data to compare against. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Hunter for some other challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. So before we start tackling the different aspects and priorities that a certain end user is interested in, we also want to understand what some of the limitations and challenges are of the data that we're using. So operational hydrology forecasts is a very specific type of model, and there's very specific and challenging things that normally arise. So I'm going to talk about some of the data inputs that we're extremely reliant on, but can be quite challenging, and some of the tools we have to overcome that. So if you work at a dam or reservoir, you're probably very familiar with this, but noisy inflow observations are quite a common thing. So this is an example of showing our pre-smooth and post-smooth observations. The lighter gray line is the raw data. So you can see it's hovering around 0 cubic feet per second, but it's wildly jumping up and down several times a day to 5,000, the negative 5,000 CFS. And physically, that's just not happening. Those are just errors from the sensor. So we smooth that data so the model is able to use and learn from the observations and the input data, but not take it too literally. So that's a very common challenge that we have to be mindful of. Some other things that come up quite a bit is like a time preference, where if an end user is only interested in certain months or seasons of the year, they only want the evaluation to focus on that time period, and they don't want it to be the statistics and metrics to be drowned out by other less important time of the year. So for this example, the flows increase in May. So this user may only be interested in that higher flow period, so they can do a time restriction. And that's something we have a lot of tooling to address and to understand how the model operated and just specify the evaluation for that specific time period. Similarly, there may be specific flow regimes that the end user is or is not interested in. So maybe they're only interested in flows above 10,000 CFS in this example, or below 5 CFS. And we've seen a lot of different varieties. So whenever we think we understand what everyone is using a forecast for, we get a new thing. So we're constantly evolving and looking for new tools to understand how to really tailor these metrics. And these are two more common examples. And yeah, another tricky one that I'll talk about is, or I talked about it already a little bit, is the poor observational data. So that's just something that we want to be mindful of and make sure that we're keeping that in mind while we're evaluating the forecast after the time has happened. And Melanie, I know you've been working on another kind of tricky aspect for input data, so I'll pass over to you to talk about that.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, this is a really important one. So I mentioned earlier that HydroForecast uses meteorological inputs to make its predictions. So we have a number of different weather forecasts that are used as inputs into HydroForecast. This here is a snapshot also from our dashboard where we have our various weather inputs. So there's this green is the ECMWF forecast. We also have GFS and GEFS. And you'll notice the gray is the actual observed precipitation. So one challenge is that, no weather forecast is perfect. For example, I always think about if I'm going to go outside and check if I need a raincoat, and I check a couple different sources if I want to understand what the weather will be. And if one of them says it's going to rain, I'll probably just grab that raincoat. So there's a lot of uncertainty in meteorological forecasts. You can see that here where this arrow is, where the actual observed rain occurred a bit earlier, a little bit more than ECMWF predicted and GEFS predicted, but a little bit less than GFS predicted. So there's a lot of uncertainty here, and that all goes into hydro forecasts. So, if you had a perfect weather forecast, that could help with the hydrology forecast. The other aspect of these meteorological forecasts and being able to see them in the dashboard when doing evaluations is that I love to go back in time and look at what the weather was predicting at that moment when we made our flow forecast, because it can be really insightful to understand and tease apart why, the model said flows would rise at a certain time. And this is kind of similarly one tool that we'll use when we're evaluating HydroForecast and trying to understand what was going on at the time. Another aspect of this external data that I always will look for when trying to understand the forecast, when it can be particularly tricky, is not just around rain, but also temperature, which is our other weather input. So you can imagine if you've got two forecasts saying it'll be above freezing and two forecasts saying it'll be below freezing, that's a lot of uncertainty that you're introducing into the model. So definitely keeping that in mind. Now, getting into the statistics, I'm not going to read through all of this here, but there are so many different metrics that exist in the world to evaluate how accurate a forecast is. And we've got a poll up for you. So if you could just tell us your favorite, we always love to ask our customers. We do evaluations for all of our customers, and we try our best to ask this question so that we can, tell you all what is most valuable for your use case. So just to highlight a couple here, we'll be talking about mean absolute percent error a little bit later on. This is the average of the absolute percent difference between the forecast and actual values, and you would want a lower score, so 0% would be your perfect forecast. Our team also tends to reference KGE or Klein-Gupta efficiency a lot, especially when we are training the model, and then we'll look at the validation period to see how well it performed. This is a nice blend of correlation bias and variability, so it can give us a really quick snapshot of how the forecast is doing as a whole during that period. And bias is also really just another helpful one. It's pretty easy to understand, is my forecast always too low or too high, or am I kind of right on? So yeah, I am looking at our favorite metrics, and it's actually pretty split across the board. The survey, 33% said KGE, so that's kind of cool. 24% RMSE, and 19% NSE. So thanks. This is good info for us.
No one said bias. Bias got 0 votes. That's surprising. I'll vote for bias. Um, nice. Thanks, Alni. Yeah, so we'll pivot a little bit into the case study section of this talk. And yeah, for this, we'll kind of be doing two things. I'll just talk about what me and Melanie and our colleagues are doing at Upstream Tech and our approach. And then we'll kind of pair it with a case study and walk you through to see how this generally actually plays out in real time. And this evaluation process, this is part of our product offering, and it's something that we do regularly to make sure that the forecasts are performing the intended use, and like I said at the beginning, are really delivering that extra value in terms of the decisions you're making with that data. So this is a process that we do periodically for all of our customers, and it's something that yeah, we also enjoy to do a lot of. So yeah, without further ado, this is a quick flow diagram of some of the questions, some of the things we're looking for to customize and tailor the evaluation to really make sure it's focusing on what our customers are using the forecast for and is really answering their important question. So I'll just really quickly go through this at a high level. HydroForecast, we have several models. We have a short-term model, which goes out 10 days. We have a seasonal model, which goes out 3 months. And we have an annual model, which predicts a year in advance. So depending which model is, it's going to be a different use case. We're going to be using different evaluation periods. So how long are we looking at for this evaluation period? And then we want to line that up with what is the end user's priority? Are they interested in a certain time of the year, certain values? And we also want to pair that with relevant statistics and metrics. We want to kind of objectively assess how the model was performing. But the quantitative metrics are really great and absolutely essential, but they may not fully represent the operational period. So we also try to look at qualitative examples. And I kind of think of this as looking at one thing through different angles. So really just trying to understand the full story of what the forecasts were doing. And then we tie all that up and wrap it into a very succinct and clear business impact to help the end users understand what this data was able to help them achieve and help justify the investment for it. So for those first 2 points, we're going to start focusing on one specific case study right now. And before Melanie talks about some of the background of it, I'll just talk about what the actual parameters were. So this was our annual model. So it's looking at stream flow values every single day out 1 year. So that's the model that we're analyzing. And the evaluation period, we wanted to compare it to a benchmark model. And in this scenario is the Northwest River Forecast Center annual forecast again. And we wanted to evaluate it with as much data as possible to look at different types of seasons and get some variability between years into that analysis. And we only had 2 years over freshet or when the spring snowmelt was. So we looked at 2025 and 2024 freshet, which was the most data we had. And yeah, I'll pass it off to Melanie to talk about some of the background of the case study.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm in New Hampshire, and while it did rain today, it was much needed. It's been super dry here, and that the river I typically walk by has been pretty low water level lately, and that's not just unique to the Northeast. The Pacific Northwest also had really dry conditions this summer. This was from back in July, and during our period that we'll be discussing today, one of the questions we were interested in is, could we, predict the low flow volumes and the dryness? And Yeah, so I think, I even looked the current one for early October, even though there's been a little bit of rain recently, still overall very dry and tough, challenging conditions for water resource managers. So this gets into what we were actually looking for and our kind of key question when we're doing the evaluation is how far ahead can I plan my reservoir operations? And when you think about the season's going to be really dry, how far ahead would I be able to trust the forecast and know that that was going to occur so I could plan for it accordingly? And then, as Hunter was saying, we want to make sure we're looking at the right metric. And for this example, we'll be talking about mean absolute percent error, and that will be our kind of metric of choice for this one. It's nice and easy to interpret. So here we have the mean absolute percent error on the y-axis. A 0 value would be perfect, completely accurate forecasts, match the observations, and higher would be more error. So this on the x-axis is the forecast issue date. So these are forecasts issued on the 1st of December, the 1st of January, February, and March. And what we're actually forecasting for is the total freshet volume. So we're looking at how accurately we could predict the freshet volume a number of months ahead. So in December, that would be about 5 months in advance of freshet, and January, February, March getting closer too. So one trend is that as you get closer to the actual time period, your error decreases, your forecasts get more accurate. That's, great, good to see that. And the dark blue here is forecast for forecast center. Really high level, just takeaway here is that, even 5 months ahead, you have a great deal of insight into what your seasonal volume will be, and that can be really valuable. I understand that if I'm looking 5 months ahead, expect around 20 to 25% error, and then if I maybe the preliminary decision into a little bit closer.
That's, a pretty quantitative example looking at the mean absolute percent error. But in addition to that, we want to evaluate this forecast as many ways as possible. So we also did some more qualitative examples. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. We have a couple different flavors we can walk through. This is more on the quantitative side of the qualitative angle, if that makes sense. But it's kind of looking at those same stats in a similar way, but rather than assigning a metric to it and doing an absolute percent error, it's just looking at the raw data of how much inflow was, which is actually what the end user was most interested in. So trying to present the data in multiple ways to try to present a complete picture. And as Melanie just said, this is the same type of setup with the months aggregated over the two freshets. The difference is just the y-axis is in millions of acre feet. So, maybe a 20% mean absolute percent error is impressive, but what does that actually mean? And this graph gives you that specific number saying, oh, that means HydroForecast overestimated by about 700,000 acre feet, while the RC overestimated by a little over 1,000,000 acre feet. And if you're an actual operator of that reservoir, that's something very tangible that you can understand. Like, what would I do with an extra 300,000 or 400,000 acre feet during the summer if I knew that was going to be happening in December? So that's kind of how we tie together that ultimate business impact, and presenting all these different flavors of the analysis is a critical part to flesh out that story. And then a bit more of a qualitative example, I'll hand it back to Melanie to go over that example.
Yeah, so a lot of times I like to look at the hydrographs. This isn't a true one, it's a stitched together forecast. So each of these are forecasts stitched together to, on the top plot, represent the 90 days ahead, and on the bottom is 120 days ahead. So, for example, if you're interested in this top one here, June 2024 peak flows, this would be what the forecast predicted 3 months ahead of that time period. And the actual plot is set up in the same way as the HydroForecast dashboard, where we've got our mean in dark blue. And all of the plots we showed so far were all metrics or total inflow volume calculated off of HydroForecast mean. What's really nice about this view is that you can also see whether or not the observations fell within our confidence intervals. So we've got the 50% and 90% confidence intervals shaded around that. The wider dashes are the river forecast center, so our forecasts that we're comparing against, and then the smaller dashes are the observations. So here you can see that the observations are pretty much entirely within our 50% confidence interval range, 3 months ahead of spring melt. So this is kind of just another way to get a sense for evaluating the forecasts. And here we can see that 4 months ahead, HydroForecast was more closely aligning to the observed rising limb of the peak flows. So
Nice. Yeah, so we just have a couple slides here to wrap up, and then we can shift over to the Q&A. And thanks everyone for dropping their questions in there. Still have any, drop them in there. There's still some time. So to wrap all of this up, we've walked through this specific case study. Now we want to tie it all together. What's the actual impact of this? How do these improved HydroForecast annual model results? What does it actually mean for the reservoir operations? So let's go to the next slide, Melanie. Thank you. So for this reservoir, similar to many reservoirs, there's multiple objectives while they're operating it. So for this reservoir, it is supplying hydropower. It's ensuring that there's enough downstream flow for sensitive aquatic species. And then other reservoirs, they're also looking at recreation, water supply benefits. And so this is also an interesting time period because it's a very dry period the past 2 years in the Pacific Northwest. So specifically for this evaluation we're looking at, one of the operational results is that you have better predictions 2 to 5 months in advance of what severity of dryness it's going to be during fresh set. And based off that, the operators can have more information on how risky or conservative they want to be while making decisions during the winter of how much to draw down that reservoir. So it's really using this delayed temporal decision making like process with the best available information so that they're controlling floods during the winter, but they're also making sure that enough water will be in the reservoir during the summer so that they can also fulfill their other purposes. And doing that more effectively will increase the amount of hydropower that can be generated, and will also make sure that there's enough water being released from the reservoir to fulfill the FERC requirements and make sure that the environmental species, the aquatic species, have enough water to thrive in. And yeah, let's go to the final slide. So backing up a little bit and generalizing this, the evaluation process that we do here at HydroForecast is able to deliver a succinct and clear bottom line of why advanced forecasts are beneficial and a worthwhile investment to multiple levels in your team, whether it's operators, energy traders, or people on the board. And we demonstrate that ROI to really make it clear that this is a net benefit tool and is something that is worthwhile from an investment standpoint. And it's also highlighting some of the operational decisions that this tool helped support during the past evaluation period, and also some of those decision-making processes that were made using this data and this tool. Yeah, So that's all I have for the slides. Melanie, I'll give you a quick second if you want to add anything. If not, we can transition into the Q&A section.
No, that was great. Thanks, Hunter. I think, yeah, we can transition to the Q&A session. We're just getting situated, reading all of the questions that are coming in. So yeah, please definitely do drop some questions in. We will do our best to answer what we can in the time left. And if we can't get to it, we'll try to follow up with you after this. So yeah, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to be here, listen to us, and join this discussion. We really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, again, please drop them in. And yeah, let's see. I think we have to pick one.
I have one that we can start with, Melanie. And then yeah, maybe you can cue the next one up. So let's see. I'm gonna pick the one about the time period for the valuation. So someone asked what the RFC forecast MAPE was over a longer term. So maybe the past 20 years or so rather than 2 years. And noting that would be interesting to do this analysis on a longer evaluation period. And yeah, that's a really good question. And that's also like one of the stops on that flow decision-making diagram that we showed. So before the models are operational, we do that type of 20-year analysis comparing benchmark models to HydroForecast. So we do have that analysis completed and available, but we decided to focus just on the past 2 years to look at how the model was performing operationally. Sometimes, and I think this is another question too, things do not track between that validation period and the operational period. And that's super important for us to understand why. And obviously, how the model performs while it's operational is much more important during the validation period. So we kind of focused on the more recent operational time period to understand that difference or discrepancy. I don't think there was one for this exact example. But yeah, mostly just to understand more of the operational year-to-year impact rather than that longer term time period. Yeah, Melanie, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add or not. Maybe we can go to the next one.
Yeah, I think that was great. And I think it's tied to another question too, is you mentioned you want at least a year of data for short-term forecasts. What about for annual models? And I did survey our engineering team about our annual model as well, even though I didn't mention it. And they suggested 3 years would be really ideal for doing seasonal forecasts, annual forecast evaluations. Again, we had 2 years to work with for this, but we're excited for next year once the forecasts have been operational for another year to add that in and see how we do. So, yeah. All right. Let's see. Next question. Do you see one, Hunter, that jumps out? I'm trying
I see
to.
one,
All right. Cool.
and there was a pun which made it stick out to me. And yeah, there's lots of pun opportunities in me and Melanie's day to day. So it's always hard to resist. But the question is, what is the downstream impact that you care about the most, and what variables, physics, heuristics is the model most sensitive to? So I'm going to take a stab at this. Apologies if I misinterpret it, but I'm understanding this as like what impacts that the model or what decisions the model is informing do we most care about? And then kind of on the flip side, what variables and inputs to the model is it most sensitive to? So in terms of downstream impacts, we really let whoever the end user is take the lead on that. And that's kind of me and Melanie's part of our job, is to develop what that downstream impact is. So some common use cases is long-term water supply planning, long-term and short-term hydropower planning, energy trading, dam safety is a really big one. And then also more environmental regulation, making sure you have enough water to follow those environmental regulations. And there's a longer list, but those are some of the most common ones. So Whatever our customer communicates that they're interested in, we align the model and the evaluation to overlap with that to make sure that that is answered. And in terms about what variables the model's most sensitive to, I think that's a tricky one to generalize. But the main inputs going into it are precipitation, which has a huge impact. The temperature, so what state that precipitation is falling in, those two are definitely super important. We're also taking in satellite data to understand snow water equivalent, snow cover percentage, and also vegetation rigor. So depending on the exact geography and hydrology, the snow cover and snow water equivalent data may be super important as well. But those are the main model inputs that are dynamic. We also have some static inputs, and those are usually the main drivers of the outputs.
Awesome. Thanks, Hunter. We probably have time for what, like maybe one more? Um, yeah, there's a really great question, and it's something we're actually always thinking about is how wide our confidence intervals are. And I think it's definitely always, our team is always working on research and development. And this is definitely one of the areas where we've had some discussions and ongoing where it's, how wide the confidence interval should be. And yeah, it's one of the areas we're always actively working on. But that's a great question is that if the mean was so good that far out, 5 months out, and the confidence intervals are wide, could you make them smaller? So I think great question. And yeah, definitely aligned with what we're thinking about.
Nice. Yeah, well, I think we're about at time here, and as was said in the chat, we have all the questions we didn't answer and who asked them. So we'll follow up individually after that to make sure that those questions get answered. But yeah, if you have any other questions that you think of, please reach out to us. You can just find our information on our website. That's probably the best way. We're always interested to continue this conversation. And we really appreciate everyone coming out and joining this webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.